13th edition of annual meeting of the new champions, also known as Summer Davos, has just come to an end in Dalian. On Tuesday, Premier Li Keqiang pledged during the meeting that China will loosen the limits on foreign investment and will ease access for foreign financial services companies into the Chinese market in 2020. How is China reshaping its role in the global economy? What are the opportunities for foreign investors with the potential further opening? And what effect is the China-U.S. trade truce having? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Zhang Gong from the University of International Business Economics and the Tangen Current Affairs commentator, and Charles Liu, founder of How Capital. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome, gentlemen. We face an explosion of novel concepts these days. For example, what does Leadership 4.0 mean on this occasion of the Summer Davos for China and for the rest of the world, Anna?
Well, there's what they want it to mean, which is creating a new vision for the world. But the reality is that you cannot have leadership unless you have consensus on what the problem is. So, for instance, on trade, at the G20, it was quite clear. It was 19-1 with the U.S. in the negative column in terms of both climate change, which is one of the big ones, and also trade, in terms of having a multipolar open trade system. And that's translating directly into the rest of the world. So when people start talking about leadership, I think the best you can say about it is it's working towards a consensus model where economies agree, a multipolar universe where leaders and countries agree as to what the way forward is. But that would mean, in some instances, dropping those who refuse to go along.
What's your short answer, Charles? What Anna says seems to suggest that it's difficult to lead by example, rather we would opt for leadership by consensus.
Well, I would say the expression you use is much more to my liking, lead by example, because in a multipolar world where you can no longer use the dollar hegemony to dominate and bash others, or using your warships, your nuclear aircraft carriers to pressure others. You can only set examples of leadership. You can only show what a leader, a dominant force should behave, how it should behave, what it should look like. I think we're headed to a multipolar world, EU being one faction, US and China, and actually it's not just China, it's all of Asia coming up.
Zhang, your version.
Well, I think leadership doesn't exist in a vacuum, has to exist in a governance system. I think we are in a transitional period right now where the incumbent governance model sort of is in shambles because, as Anna has referred to, the United States is taking a very different approach. It's essentially, in my opinion, withdrawing from the very set of institutions that the United States set up 70 years ago after the Second World War. Now we are entering into a new era now, in that the existing governance model, the existing global governance model, is sort of having a challenge right now from the United States. So, in this era, what do we mean by leadership? Leadership has to exist in a framework, in a governance framework, and we're still trying to sort of defend this multilateral system, or maybe improve or move into a new model. It's not known yet, depending on what's coming from Washington. And I think that's the challenge that the world is facing right now.
Read their lips and you will be left disillusioned as to what is smart leadership. Everybody is talking smart about smart leadership. It seems a shared leadership is no leadership. And you guys seems to give us a strong feeling it's difficult to assume leadership, either by China or the United States, given their growing animosity and deepening mistrust. Anna?
Well, I don't know if it's animosity. I think this is a political theater. The U.S. is trying to paint China as the bad guy because they feel that China is a legitimate competitor. You had the same thing happen with Japan. It resulted in the
1980s.
Yes. There's never been a time when things, I mean, and you can even see it further. I mean, Trump immediately went after Vietnam, after Vietnam's trade surplus with the U.S. went up. He said, oh, they're the second worst nation around. I mean, it's very clear he's not going to let any kind of economic competitor rise up against, as John said, this kind of hegemony.
President Trump not only wants to assume world leadership, but he also wants to take the Nobel Peace Prize by going to Panmunjom and have a surprise handshake with Kim Jong-un and cross the 38th parallel. However, don't you think the presidency of Donald Trump has always been held hostage by domestic politics, and he finds himself trailing behind Joseph Biden? Therefore, we got to pay more attention to the political agenda in the United States, domestic politics, right?
Well, I don't think we should formulate our own strategy and agenda based on what he does, because.
But he tweets his messages constantly.
That's the whole idea. It's not only tweeting, but I'll be in the neighborhood. Let me stop by and shake hands. In terms of Panmunjom, that's basically what
Did he
he
bring
said.
a casserole with him?
No, all he wants to do is to stay in the media. Do everything possible to stay in the media on a continuous basis, even if it means saying A today and Z tomorrow. It doesn't really matter. Now it's not a really domestic agenda, because that's not a strategy. That's a tactic to keep his face in the media.
He riveted world attention by even talking smart about the Beauty and Beast when Ivanka showed up.
With Pompeo.
Secretary Pompeo. Well, let's come back to examine the theme of Davos Summit in January. Not summit, Davos Forum in January. It's globalization 4.0. It seems what President Xi stands for in the initiative of BRI gets closer to the definition of globalization 4.0. It means interconnectivity, interdependence, co-prosperity, a community of shared future. But whatever China says would fall on the deaf ears of the Trump team, right, Anna?
Well, of course. I mean, they're not going to let Xi have any kind of credit on this. He has to be painted as the man in black, as the guy with the black hat who's the evil person that the U.S. has to fight. So, these are theatrics. And it's not just that he wants to be the center of attention. Trump is trying to divert attention, and he's doing so very successfully with his international things. I mean, when he was talking about, in private, well, why do we have a mutual defense treaty with Japan? I mean, this certainly grabbed some attention, and it took a number of well, no, everyone had to react to it. So they're not reacting to the Mueller report or all the rest of the things, them going after his taxes, his negative poll numbers. So this is one way in which he can push this. So I agree with Charles completely. You should not formulate a strategy on a person who is going day to day. He's transactional.
Even tactic.
Yeah, tactics.
Even
high-pressure tactics. Don't you think the rest of the world are quickly getting tired of his high-pressure tactics?
It's
when you look at the Chinese phrase "qian li ji qiong," if you repeat the same approach over and over for years, then people easily get tired.
It's outrageous to say that India is no longer a developing country. It's just getting so absurd. But that's his style.
But
he's taking a bilateral approach with everyone,
And look what he did.
Also,
No. Can I bring you guys back from the attention on Trump to our theme in Davos? He tries to steal spotlight. We don't want to give him the favor.
Okay.
So, externally, let's look at, because this is a world global forum, and it's a global forum on world economy. What are the most serious external challenges for not only China and for the rest of the world? Now, Zhu Min, chief economist of IMF, said at the Davos forum, no deal Brexit for the UK could be one of the heavy blows. And Schwab, founder of World Economic Forum, said the world economy is facing a transition.
I agree.
Right. So let's look at these two major issues one by one. John, what do you make of, say, the no no-deal Brexit and its impact upon the world economy?
Well, I think if there's a no deal, if the Brexit becomes a nasty deal, or there's a no deal at all, it will create a lot of chaos in Europe. And I think the certain European countries, some of these countries are already entering into economic problems, and it's going to further exacerbate the economic picture in Europe, and it's going to have repercussions on the world stage. It's going to affect other countries have a trading relationship with
Immediately,
Europe.
we'll find ourselves facing two standards, the European standard and the UK standard concerning financial services. Charles, right?
Absolutely. The City of London, for example, which is a major financial center, including as the leading place for trading of euro-based bonds. It's in London. What happens if there's a no-deal Brexit? You end up, okay, all transactions, on what standard and basis do you calculate on?
Well, interestingly enough, when you mention that, this is the problem that Britain has. They do not have the standards to replace it. They've been in the EU so long, they've been going along. They're going to. My guess is that the City of London has had enough time to kind of look at this, and that they're going to have standards that go along with that. But the loss of jobs in the UK and the resulting kind of tsunami wave of what you point out that will hit the European Union members is going to be disastrous.
Perhaps we are a little bit too worried too early. Boris Johnson will be the easiest one. Look at his hairstyle.
Just like Donald.
Well, I think what Schwab is referring to, I think represents an even bigger challenge. I think the global economy is having troubles, I think, and we are entering into a period of time that's stormy, storms ahead. It's going to be quite difficult if all the countries don't get together to come up with some kind of a coherent, coordinated
even without no deal Brexit, Europe is expected to grow below 1% this year. And Germany will be lucky to break even. And the U.S., of course, the sugar high of the tax cut is now gone. So 1.5 trillion in budget deficit this year. So it doesn't look good.
A third major challenge coming from outside China and the world is facing, I'm afraid, is the fluctuations in interest rate of Federal Reserve. President Trump's not very happy with the chairman of Federal Reserve. He threatens to fire him. That's a very different issue. But do you think any major change in the interest rate, hike or down, would create a major difference for the world economic outlook?
I thought you told us we weren't going to talk about Trump. Anyway, getting back to that, yeah, the problem is that most economists believe that we are heading into recession. The question is when and how long. If the Fed starts cutting rates now, as you're approaching it, I mean, remember the yield curve has been negative now for 3 months. And there's never been a period in economic history where that hasn't foretold a recession coming. So maybe this is the exception, the fact that we're in the longest bull run in history. But the Fed has been trying to save up and create a cushion that they could use to stimulate the economy in the event that there is a recession. If through political means Donald Trump did it, it's going to be a sugar high, as you said. It'll push more money into a system that is actually overrunning with money. And that will cause more bubbles. You're going to see an even harder recessionary hit. Because it's like staying drunk for a long time. The hangover is going to be much worse.
It's not just the major challenge, it's the problem itself. And Donald Trump is the problem itself. Do you think the endless tax reduction policy that he would hammer home without exceptions on the campaign trail would be yet another attractive approach so that his approval rating would be shored up and that the U.S. economy would become stronger? John?
I think the record has shown that his tax reduction hasn't seen the money yet. I mean, we haven't seen the kind of corroborate the theory that tax reduction would stimulate the economy and tax revenues will come in. No, it's not like that. I mean, the deficit keeps expanding, and people are starting to realize this. Of course, in the United States, average folks don't pay attention to this, don't understand the economics of this. But sooner or later, the message is going to hit home that his policy is not working here, and it's creating a huge amount of fiscal deficit.
It's actually worse than that, because what the sugar high has done in terms of corporations getting big tax cuts, where did the profits go?
Buybacks.
Share buybacks. There was a major Western media came out with a report that if it weren't for the share buybacks, the S&P 500 would be 19% below what it is today. And of course, for the CEOs, buybacks are very significant because their bonuses are tied to share price. So you actually have a situation, 2/3 of the S&P 500, those of us in the financial jargon would say 2/3 had no growth in the top line. But they had a massive bottom line increase from the tax break.
And there's another statistic we can pay attention to. That this has been the worst period since 2012 in industrial development. I mean, it is way, way down. So if this was intended to spur industrial
CapEx
development, it's way down.
It didn't happen.
It's way down.
It's not just a problem that arises from the presidency of Donald Trump. It's also our domestic economic woes in China. For example, the era of double-digit growth is over in our country. What about the downward economic pressure? What does that mean for the opening up and reform when you look at the speech of Premier Li Keqiang at the opening of the summer Davos? John?
I think as we all know it, we're getting, in my opinion, we're getting close to the low end of that 6 to 6.5 range. And I think the days of China's growth staying above 6% is probably quite numbered. I think we're quite rapidly approaching the time of maybe even 5% range. In a way, the bottom line is that China is, in my opinion, entering into a block of those developed countries, more like developed countries, where the growth rate is very low. I mean, historically, the developed world, if you see a 3%, 4% growth rate, that's very good, right? That's very good. We actually get into that territory. In economics, we have this convergence theory. It's we can't keep going.
In theory, we are entering into that territory of remaining low or putting at the low level. However, what about the issue of employment? That's the top concern of the politicians and policymakers in China.
Go ahead, sorry.
Yes. That said, gentlemen, Premier Li Keqiang said that China will scale back ownership limits for foreign investors in its financial sector by the year 2020, a year ahead of schedule. How will the new policy affect China's financial market, facing the mounting pressure from the U.S.? Anna?
Well, China enjoyed the largest FDI, a record FDI influx in 2018, and so far this year it's 3.7% ahead of last year. So what you have here is it's all about markets. Everybody, if you're going to grow, you need a place to sell, and China is the largest game on the planet. The fact that China has shown that it's gone beyond this kind of borrowing innovation to creating it, this has been a real eye-opener for people. So, think about it. Investment is pouring into China, all right, as the U.S. is attacking it. Right. So it is not going the way that Donald Trump would have thought it would have. He was trying to scare away investment and push it back to the U.S. Exact opposite.
Well, when you have 110,000 families with investable assets of over 100 million each for the banks, for the financial institutions all over the world.
You're one of them, I guess.
We don't discuss these things.
I'm not that intrusive. I don't care about your privacy.
Insurance companies, investment bankers, asset managers, fund managers. Oh my God, this is fantastic. But I think what's really significant here is it's time for China to open up a bit on the financial services side. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, during the Asian financial crisis, the hedge funds were wreaking havoc in Southeast Asian countries, and China couldn't deal with it, and so we had the Great Wall for a long time. But now, the Chinese financial services industry expertise is just as sophisticated as anybody in New York or London or Zurich.
I'd say on the international scale, but domestically at home, one of the problems holding back the banks is that they don't have this level of expertise in assessing risk. They're good on assets, but not on that. And that, I think, will be helped by allowing foreign institutions to come in, because they do have this background. They can
management.
Risk management on the personal loan level, on the small and medium-sized enterprises, and this could be very helpful to China. And it brings in more investment.
And a couple of days ago, I was interviewing President Li Keqiang, president of the AIIB, right here in your position. And perhaps the AIIB has set a very good example by inviting a good team of experts who does have the technology and technical know-how in assessing risks.
Right. Well, they've been, if you look at the Western financial institutions, they've been running amok for many, many decades, if not a century. So they're more experienced, more sophisticated. I think adoption of a lot of their technologies for China would be good, but not blind following of Wall Street.
I'd agree. I mean, you start looking at the number of fines that have been paid by Deutsche Bank, by you know,
HSBC.
all the banks, HSBC, the U.S., RBS, you name them. There really isn't anybody who's untainted. And it was because there wasn't regulatory controls in place. And I think China's learned that. So while the door is open, it doesn't mean that the cupboard, that the lockbox is open.
Yeah.
Well, let's look at the efforts by Chinese enterprises to go global. What do you think are the major obstacles for them? To my knowledge, the Chinese authorities are tightening grip on the outbound capital flight. Will that create a real barrier for the merger and acquisition by Chinese enterprises? Perhaps
not the Chinese. It's not the Chinese side which is blocking it.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things here. One is corporate China is expanding overseas in terms of, buying assets, buying new technologies, buying, great companies. And I think that route is getting more and more difficult. I mean, you're seeing that the Chinese investment in the United States is really sort of, down to a trickle now. It's not happening.
Huawei is beating retreat. Alibaba is beating retreat. We are just coming back.
Yeah, so that's
you're being pushed out. You're not being.
And I think corporate China really have to rely on itself to be, indigenously innovative. It can rely on. These days are gone. I think you can easily buy some companies and turn their products into your own products and try to, be a global force. And these days are gone. I think. On the other side, there's also the issue of Chinese companies expanding overseas, doing business, participating in Belt and Road Initiative, establishing presence in developing countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia. On this side, I think Chinese companies are doing actually quite well. Of course, there are issues and problems, and I think Chinese companies are still learning. They're starting to perfect these practices. They're answering we're actually answering to the criticisms of, say, international organizations coming from World Bank, for example, even from the United States. People, companies are learning, and I think in that aspect, there's a lot of future. These companies know how to prosper and thrive in a very difficult environment where typically West companies don't go. In Africa, for example, Chinese companies are doing very well over there.
Now, in some instances, they're doing well, but they're not doing well by the local community, and there has been a lot of tensions. I mean, we're talking about the gold miners in some of these places who are kind of lawless and things like that.
Referring to perfecting.
Okay, let's look at the impact of a truce in the trade disputes between the United States and China. Okay, we know that there was a handshake in Panmunjom, not between Kim Jong-un and President Donald Trump, but between Mr. Xi Jinping and his American counterpart. But where is the 38th parallel, figuratively? For example, Huawei. Let's look at Huawei. President Trump says he would allow American companies to sell equipment and software to Huawei, but Mr. Deng Zhenghui says in his latest interview that Huawei is relying more on its own R&D team and efforts. Huawei could buy software and equipment from American suppliers, but it doesn't matter as much as it did. What does he mean, John?
Well, I think this is very important. I think one of the things that the United States government has caused damage in the telecom community is that from now on, people are going to look back and say, look, this global value chain labor division or function division is not reliable anymore. people get scared.
No, the American component is not reliable.
Well, the American component is unreliable. Okay, but anything can happen, right? So from now on, even though Huawei is buying components and parts from American companies, I think behind the scene, they're developing further their own solutions, right? So I think the damage is already done. You know, it's
irretrievable damage.
It's irreparable damage. It's irreparable damage.
I would even go further. It's not damage is done. What will happen going forward is that the whole world will not be trusting American companies.
Yeah.
Will want to have.
And that was the argument that was put forward by the association that represents these Silicon Valley behemoths.
Yeah.
They actually went to Trump and said, "You are killing us. No one will see us as reliable." But in Huawei's case, only 17% of the phones actually rely on U.S. technology.
Exactly.
So it's. There's going to be no question. There's going to be a decoupling there because there's been a break of trust. And once you've done that, it's very difficult to go back.
Even if you sell to them now, it doesn't mean that they're not building a back.
Yeah, but I mean, look, let's look at this. I mean, Navarro comes out, Trump's guy, and says, "Oh, we're only selling this stuff that had no security risk." Well, then why did you say in the original time that you're not selling them anything because it's a security risk?
National emergency.
Yes. So, I mean, there's absolutely no credibility to this. It's seen as a political card, and this is really bothering the business community.
By the end of the day, we have to look at the resilience of the Chinese economy, and many people pin their hopes on the growing army of the middle class in terms of domestic spending. Do you agree, Charles, that the formidable army of the middle class, their purchasing power would be the silver lining in the darkest clouds?
I think it's part of economic development. When you have 300 to 400 million middle class in China, still numbers going up, and then you have integrally the rest of Asia, the middle class in Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries. ASEAN countries is about 700 million now, and it's about 30% middle class. And then you have India, maybe 15% middle class, but that's 1.3 billion people. So out of 3.7 billion people, 20% is 720 million middle class. That is all tied together into one massive consumer market in Asia. That even the U.S., entire population of the U.S. and the G7 countries added together doesn't come close to it. So I think it's not just China's middle class. In this context, we have to look at the whole rise of Asia. That's not containable. No matter what the U.S. tried to do, you can't suppress it anymore.
Economic gravity.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen to the third and the fourth tier cities in China? In cities with a population between 3 and 5 million, the traditional policy of the household registration system is being eliminated. And that means it will lay the groundwork for the coming of talented professionals, particularly the young labor force with skills. Do you think this will add to or fuel the process of urbanization, and that's yet another engine of China's economic resilience, John?
Well, that's what the market is supposed to do. When you have rising costs in major cities, companies going to move to places where costs are relatively low. Huawei is a very good example. Move out of Shenzhen and move to Dongguan. It's a lot more affordable over there. So, I mean, these things we have already seen in the United States. I mean, companies move out of New York City into New Jersey suburbs and further down to the south, going to North Carolina, those places. I think in China it's not going to be exception. The economics force is going to work fundamentally to lead to that scenario you're talking about. Hopefully that will also revitalize the third or fourth tier cities where we haven't seen the kind of the bustling economic activities in the leading cities on the coast.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for your very insightful contributions. To play it safe, it's a wise move by Huawei to be relocated to Dongguan, which has become a cleaner city after demolition of the prostitution industry. Don't laugh. I mean, it's a very serious business, all right? It's a safer place.
The prostitution business.
Okay, thank you so much for being a meaningful part of this dialogue on the World Economic Forum Summer Davos version in Dalian. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.